It's with sadness and a heavy heart that we mark the death of one of the world's most distinguished scientists and finest global citizens. James J. McCarthy died this past week on December 11th. It now remains for us all to recall his achievements, celebrate his service, and affirm his enduring inspiration not only for us, but all of humankind. In the past, we've celebrated various people that we've labeled grassroots global leaders, like Bill McKibben, who you've heard us talk about before, and people like Gus Beth, who we, in effect in our culture, criminalized and locked up, along with Bill McKibben. You'll see they stood side by side out in front of the White House, and they were both arrested. He was dean of the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Sciences at the time. He's retired now, but he's still working hard on a grassroots global level. We've honored Dr. James Hansen as well as a grassroots global leader. And Tim DeChristopher, former student at the Harvard Divinity School, who actually spent hard time in jail because of his protection of the environment. Ross Gelbspan as well is well known in the Boston area as a former Pulitzer Prize winning journalist for the Boston Globe, drew attention to the whole question of the corruption of the press by the purchasing of influence and slanted storytelling on the part of the fossil fuel industry. And Paul Epstein, who died back in 2011, was one of the visionaries from a grassroots global perspective, thinking about planetary physiology, integrating. He's thinking about both human and planetary health. All of these people have been honored as grassroots global leaders, along with some who are still quite active globally, like Kumi Naidoo, and Naomi Klein, who's been through this region recently with a series of books, including an important one called This Changes Everything. And in fact, there have been local leaders who've been on the international speaking circuit, in fact most recently at Madrid meetings of the Conference of Parties in Madrid this last week. William Mumma. He and his wife Margot have been outstanding grassroots global leaders. Now we want to honor James McCarthy in this regard as well. He's been recognized among climate scientists with a whole series of awards, and rightly so, and most recently the Tyler Prize, an extraordinary prize for someone who's done outstanding work not only in science, but in the application of science to public policy. It's a rare kind of prize because scientists are rewarded often for their lab work or their field work or their experimental work or their theoretical work, but not for their outreach to the larger community. In fact, there's not much to be gained in most scientific careers by making your work accessible to the public. That's often considered down market or popularizing. And it doesn't, in fact, win you a lot of recognition. Or if it does, it's usually negative recognition from colleagues who feel that you're reaching out beyond the bounds of the appropriate science to a public that is often uncomprehending and unappreciative. But the Tyler Prize went in part this year to this distinguished gentleman, James J. McCarthy, and he well deserves it. You can find that material on transitionstudies.net. In fact, the tribute they paid to him is worth listening to at length, because it gives an indication. It's almost a kind of recipe for what a scientist needs to do to reach out to the wider public when he's come up with insights and data that will change the course of the future human prospect. Harvard's recognized this for a while. Back in 2002, 17 years ago, I published a special cover issue of their Harvard magazine, and in it they carried an article called The Great Global Experiment, which, you won't be surprised to find out, was a kind of portrait of James J. McCarthy, talking about a trip to Alaska and the disappearance of polar ice. Now, back in 2002, this was known to a few scientists who were studying it as a matter of their specialty, but it wasn't known to the public at large, and it was something that the Harvard magazine felt the world should know about. So they devoted this special article to it, entitled The Great Global Experiment. Look it up. Get it out of the library. Find it online. The Great Global Experiment. It's pretty staggering. Full-page picture of him on the edge of the ocean, to start off the article, by Jonathan Shaw, and then an extended interview with him about what's going wrong with our changing climate, or, as it was put on the title of the magazine, Changing Our Climate, Causes and Choices. Now, this is something James J. McCarthy emphasized at the time, that we had choices to make, but those choices were going to have staggering impacts for the rest of our lives and for the generations to come. Harvard has always regarded him as one of their senior statesmen, and in fact, once they chose for the first time ever to create a Distinguished Service Award, they called upon Jim to present that Distinguished Service Award to Lester Brown, honoring 50 years of his service as the inventor of the World Watch Institute, the founder of it, and an early voice for the protection of the global environment. Harvard, trying to recognize, in effect, the 50 years of Lester Brown's achievement, called upon their most distinguished scientists to confer this Distinguished Service Award, the first ever that they, in fact, devised for this. And in fact, Jim McCarthy was behind the whole concept of devising a Distinguished Service Award for, in effect, humanity, to be given to Lester Brown. Advising on climate issues is something that several scientists do, including Dr. Dan Schrag, as you can see on the left, and the dean of the school, the faculty of engineering and applied sciences, who you see in the middle, and then Jim on the right. Advising on climate change is what they've been doing for decades to nation-state governments and to the international community. In fact, if you look back at the history of any of this, some of these early circular newsletters look a little quaint compared to what's being produced nowadays. But in the winter of 2001, you can see it's volume 2, number 1, is put out, and it's the winter of 2001. Volume 2, number 1 of this climate report has within it its very first article, after a letter to the editor, is on the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the third assessment report of 2001 by James J. McCarthy. Now, why does he write this article? He writes the article because he's a co-author and co-convener of the IPCC Third Assessment Report on Impacts. Working Group 2, as it was known. And this was an extraordinary achievement. It represented, until that point, the largest international collaboration of scholars in human history. Climate Change, 2001, Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability was its title. It was published by Cambridge University Press, but the printed version was over 1,000 pages. You couldn't easily carry this around. You basically, if you were doing research in the area of the sciences, wanted to download it as a PDF file. And they made it available as a PDF file. In fact, the IPCC loaded it as a full report in several different languages up on their server, and you can get access to this through transitionstudies.net, the website that supports a lot of this research. You can get access to it. The assessment report was referred to, TAR, Climate Change 2001, Impacts, Adaptation, and Vulnerability. Over 1,000 pages of printed data and hypertexted data that's presented online in HTML format and then in PDF format as well. Now, having co-authored and co-chaired this whole process was a major achievement in itself, well beyond the scientific journals that he was writing for individually. He convened this group of international scholars to assess the judgments being made in other journals around the world. That's what the IPCC does. It's an intergovernmental panel on climate change that assesses and puts out in an assessment report, AR as they call it, the assessment report, about every 5 years. The literature that's been published in the intervening 5 years. And that's what he had mastered, and mastered the editing process to bring together the biggest single volume, the assessment of climate change, that had ever existed up until then. He then became well known, if he hadn't been before, in science circles, and eventually became president of the AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the largest organization of scientists in the world. And as president of the AAAS, he was recommended, acknowledged, and in fact thanked at great length by various people like Al Gore. Now, you may remember Al Gore received a Nobel Prize as a co-recipient along with the IPCC. They were co-recipients of the Nobel Prize. And in one respect, Al Gore, as it was said at the time, was the first person in human history ever to receive a Nobel Prize for a slideshow. Well, as it turns out, his slideshow was largely based on information, data, and images that were provided for him by James J. McCarthy. It's appropriate in that sense that James J. McCarthy was a co-recipient as an IPCC member with Al Gore of that prize. He went well beyond teaching in his own courses and advising to international groups like the IPCC. He started to visit courses throughout Harvard and very generously gave a series of lectures like the ones he would give every year through the Harvard Extension School in the course on global climate change, the science, social impact, and diplomacy of a world environmental crisis. Each year he would come to that group, which is known as Harvard's Night School. These are the people who gather after Harvard goes home, in a sense. They close down their classrooms for the day, but in the evening they're taken over in large part by very creative courses coming out of the Harvard Extension School. And there, James J. McCarthy showed up each year in this course that was co-taught by William Mumma, one of the other people that we've cited, and, in effect, one of the other recipients of the Nobel Prize, because he too was very active in the IPCC process. But his impact wasn't limited to the climate group. He, in fact, influenced students over the years who took up themes of environmental justice, looking particularly at the impact that climate change was going to have on different communities around the country and around the world. And one of his more distinguished students, PhD in his department, Earth and Planetary Sciences, was a fellow named Nicky Sheets, who served for years in the environmental justice community, especially down in New Jersey, but would come up on a regular basis and give lectures in the course called Introduction to Environmental Justice that was convened by James Hoyt. Now, James Hoyt was a member, along with James J. McCarthy, of the Union of Concerned Scientists. And the two of them developed strategies for expanding upon the thinking that Jim McCarthy had been doing about climate change for the expanded question of what's that going to mean for environmental justice. And sure enough, as a member of the Union of Concerned Scientists, and eventually its president, or I should say the chairman of its board, Jim McCarthy spent a lot of time trying to think about how the Union of Concerned Scientists could address issues of environmental justice, science, and democracy. He helped, in fact, set up an environmental justice component of the Union of Concerned Scientists, and, in fact, created a Center for Science and Democracy while he was there as chairman of the board of the UCS, the Union of Concerned Scientists, and that functions today to emphasize the kind of links between science and people's lives through the Union of Concerned Scientists, looking particularly at the social justice questions of what the scientific community was finding out. Further than that, and further than Harvard, and further than the Union of Concerned Scientists, he reached out to communities not normally in touch with scientists at all. Some of this was captured by the public broadcasting system and their program called Now, when they did a special on God and global warming. This was an extraordinary effort to reach out. Very few scientists ever spend any time talking with theologians or with ministers or bishops. But James J. McCarthy, along with Eric Shivian, Dr. Eric Shivian from the Harvard Medical School, organized a trip through Alaska, bringing scientists and evangelical ministers together to talk about some of the issues. Here you can see Dr. Eric Shivian, the Reverend Richard Cizik, an evangelical leader, and Dr. James J. McCarthy, as they are up in Alaska. And in fact, if you want to follow this, you can scan in the code and get right to the information. It's pretty staggering when you look at it. And you can take a look at it on the site of Transition Studies. Call it up if you get a chance and look into it. It's pretty amazingly a witness of the kind of thing that's very rare in usual circuits, but very important.
Now on PBS, global warming is changing the face of Alaska.
Man, this is weird. 'cause we never see this kind of stuff before growing up.
Ice-free seas advance as rapidly melting glaciers retreat.
The ice was just the other side of this rope, right here, and you could reach down and touch it.
Enter the scientists and their unlikely traveling companions, evangelical Christians.
The evangelical community, many of them don't trust science.
Can they be convinced to preach the message of global warming? An unusual journey of faith and reason.
All that on now. With David Brancaccio. The weekly news magazine from PBS. Funding for now is provided by...
Well, you can see that it had funding from different foundations and the like, but it was very interesting encounter between scientists and evangelicals inside the Arctic Circle for them to see, in effect, what the heck was going on as a result of what goes on in cities.
David Brancaccio.
Welcome to Now. We're about to go on the road to Alaska to do two things. First, to see for ourselves what scientists say are the effects of what spews out of that cityscape behind me, carbon dioxide. The effects are on the Alaskan ice and the people who live on that ice. But here's why I really want you to stay and watch with us. It's the journey of an influential evangelical minister who arrives in Alaska convinced that people have become too alarmist about global warming. He travels with a group of other ministers and scientists to the edge of the Arctic Circle. And I'll take a look and see. My colleague Carla Murthy went to Alaska and produced the piece.
We'll be there probably in about 15 minutes.
Thousands of tourists every year drive about an hour from Anchorage, Alaska to see a real live glacier. The visitor center used to be a good spot to see the face of the glacier. So where's the ice? Well, way over yonder. Since Portage Glacier began melting, it's retreated over 3 miles.
What was originally here for the last 18,000 years is now there.
Utterly astonishing.
Yeah.
Richard Cizik and Eric Shivian see this as a sad consequence of global warming. Both consider climate change to be the greatest man-made threat to the environment and have been working together to fight it.
The rate of melting is speeding up.
Who would have thought? One is a big-time scientist, the other a big-time evangelical Christian.
Okay, well, I urge you to look into this and, in fact, watch the entire piece. It's really quite extraordinary and very important as an example of the conversations that Jim McCarthy would engage in, well beyond academe, to reach people. If human civilization is to survive, we must all learn to make the transition to a solar sustainable world. Fortunately, thanks to Jim, there is a new kind of citizen science alliance that is emerging around the world to work together to devise a just transition to a sustainable future.